kind of milestone. So thank you for doing that for us. So I'll start us off. My name is Sally Manninen. I'm the director of the Choose to Be Healthy Coalition. We're here located at York Hospital, though we are fully grant funded with federal and state grants to support substance use prevention efforts in Southern York County. And we cover 9 communities, 5 schools. I think we've got 3 of our schools represented in this group today, which is super. And I'm going to have my co-workers, the staff of Choose to Be Healthy, introduce themselves real quickly.
Hi, everybody. I'm Gina Brodsky, prevention specialist here at Choose to Be Healthy, and most of the time the school contact for all of you, and I'm so excited to see all your faces and really appreciate you being here this morning.
Everyone, I'm Stephanie. I'm a program coordinator here at Choose to Be Healthy, and it's good to see everyone today.
So I just want to briefly say how we came to be here today. As part of my work, I attend many trainings and webinars around prevention and supporting resilient youth and social emotional learning, etc. And over the summer, I attended a national training put through Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services. And it featured our guest speaker, Sue Badeau, who's going to introduce herself in a moment. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is such a great presentation for teachers, for schools to start us off after a really strange summer and strange last year and going into potentially another transitional year. And I thought her message was great. And so I immediately emailed Eric Waddell, your superintendent, and I said, Eric, what do you think of this? Do you think this is a useful webinar to start the school year? And he said, yes. Oh my gosh, I was thinking I wanted to start us off on mental health and social emotional learning, etc. And so it was just a perfect synthesis, and I can't thank Eric enough to make it a priority so that all of you are here today. I hope you get something out of it, and our hope is that you do, and that we will do a follow-up at some point in the next few months to see how everybody's doing with this same topic of helping you be resilient and helping your students be resilient through this time. And Eric, did you want to add anything to that?
I just want to thank you, Sally, and your team for providing such important support and resources to the member schools in the coalition. I'm honored to be part of the advisory board of Choose to Be Healthy, and I can tell you that we capitalize on what Sally and her team bring to this region. And so anyway, when Sally reached out to me this summer, she's right. That's exactly one of the key points that I wanted to touch upon during these 3 days. And so thank you, Sally. And Sally's right. We will be doing follow-up during the year. This is not just a one-off. We fully recognize that if there's any time, you're probably at your best right now in terms of your own personal mental health and the mental health of your students. So we need to be aware of that, and that recognize that, a few months into this, it's going to be time for a little refresher and a check-in. And so I look forward to coordinating that with Sally and her team. So thank you again for this opportunity, and Sue, welcome.
That's great. Thanks, Eric. So Sue is, you will find her background and even where she is right now is interesting. Everything about Sue is interesting. So Sue, because you're so interesting, and I can't do it justice except to say that when I saw and heard your background, I was just like, oh my God, I love this woman. So if you could introduce yourself, that'd be lovely.
Good morning, everyone. I'm here. My name is Sue Badeau, and I am on camera for a few moments here while I do the introduction. Then I will go ahead and turn my camera off. And as has been mentioned, you are all invited and welcome to do the same. But I am, if it looks like I'm in a vehicle, it's correct. I am. I'm in an RV. Since the pandemic started, my husband and I decided to start living full-time in an RV. We even gave up our apartment. And so we've been in a safe bubble throughout the pandemic in an RV. We have many children. We adopted many children from the foster care system. Mostly came to us as older children. And so I have both a professional and personal background in children's mental health and child trauma in particular. But before that, I went to college. And when I went to college at Smith College in Massachusetts, I majored in early childhood education and special ed, and have been a certified teacher in my lifetime. And so teachers are kind of my people, and I always love the opportunity to have time with people who work day to day in the schools, whether teachers, support staff, administrators, everybody in the schools. And with 22 children, 20 adopted and 2 by birth, and the 75 youth that we fostered in addition, as well as the refugee children from Sudan and Kosovo that we hosted in our homes, 12 of them altogether. You can imagine that we spent many hours and hours and hours at schools trying to ensure that not only the academic and educational needs, but in fact the social, emotional, and mental health needs of our own children and the children that came into our lives were being met on a regular basis. And now we're grandparents of over 40 children, so it continues. I grew up in Vermont. And although I'm a bit of a nomad now, I did grow up in New England and Vermont, and my uncle lived in Sanford, Maine, and he had a little cottage on the ocean over near there, and so I used to spend time in Maine every summer as well. So it's a little bit of a homecoming to come and talk with all of you. In fact, my annual trip to Maine was just 2 weeks ago. I was up there with family celebrating one of my sister's milestone birthdays. So anyway, it's great to be here with all of you. Because of being in an RV, I never can be exactly 100% sure what the Wi-Fi connectivity is going to be. Feels pretty good right now, but it's even better when I turn my camera off. So I'm going to do that in just a moment. And even then, if it gets shaky, just please let me know. I'll try some alternative things to improve it if we need to, but hopefully we won't need that. I did want to say one other thing about the interaction. Please, we will have poll, because there's so many of us, we can't have people's sound on. We can't do just direct talking back and forth. But we can use the chat box. So please type anything you want into the chat box, comments, questions, reflections. I'll try to keep an eye on it, but I also have Gina and Stephanie and Sally helping with that. I'll do some polls. When I do the polls, hopefully you'll see them on your device. You can answer them, but I also will read them out loud. So in case you can't see it, you won't be left out of the process. I don't see who answers what in regard to the polls. I just see the total number of responses. So it's anonymous in that regard. But the polls and the use of the chat are primary ways that we can be interactive. And this is such a interactive, engagement focused topic that we're talking about today. I hope you will take advantage of those opportunities to interact in some way. So with that said, I'm going to put my camera off and I'm going to pull my screen up so that you can see the PowerPoint, which hopefully you can all see now. And this is the moment when I'll go ahead and we'll do that first poll. So the first poll, and I'm going to read it out loud for you, says, I just like to have a little bit of an idea of who is here, and it is set up as multiple choice. So if more than one of these hats apply to you, please check them. Teacher, educator in general population, teacher, educator in special ed, school counselor or social worker, support staff, administration, athletic department, school staff who is also a parent of young children, or other. And if you select other and would like to identify what that may mean to you, you can write something in the chat if you like, not required. And it looks like we've had about almost 90% of you already reply. So we're just going to leave the poll up for a few more seconds and then we'll close it down and show the results. Okay, I think we were over 95%, so we will share those results. And we have lots of teachers. So the biggest number of people when we combine teachers in both general pop and special ed, and those teachers who also are school staff who also are parents. We have a lot of teachers, but I'm glad for the diversity that we have people who also here representing other roles within the school community. So thank you for participating in that poll, and we'll close it out. And sometimes when we close it out on the on our own presenter screen, sometimes it doesn't always, I've learned with Zoom, it doesn't always close on other people's screens. So if that's the case, and if you still see the poll showing up, please feel free to just click it off your screen for now. So we're going to start by talking about COVID and the impact on schooling in general. And before I get into sharing with you some facts and awarenesses and tips, I wanted to mention the survey that was done. Oh, and thank you. I noticed a couple of people putting their responses in the chat about the last poll. So that's terrific. Thank you for that. The survey that was done just this week, and a good many of you did respond to, is really guiding. So as Sally mentioned, I did a very similar workshop as this for a national audience. Many of the slides, if you saw that workshop and this one, you'll say, yep, many of the slides are the same, but I did make a few alterations here and there. And the alterations came because I dug into a little more into some specific things that I thought would be most meaningful to you specifically based on what I had heard from Sally and from the others in your leadership, Eric and others, but also from what I learned from your survey. And so I know that there's challenges that you're anticipating, challenges related to just how will you get students kind of back in the swing of things, how will you get them adjusted, how will they respond to being back in person for those who haven't been, as well as challenges related to questions about masking or vaccinating. And this is not a medical webinar, so I won't be addressing those particular questions, but just kind of acknowledging those concerns, and also your own support needs for yourselves as teachers and other members of the school community, and especially being able to share and support one another. So I hope that you'll notice a thread of addressing some of those concerns throughout this webinar, but also that you will be invited and will continue to participate in follow-ups that happen later in the fall after this webinar to really drill down and dig deeper and make sure that the things you raised in the survey are getting addressed in ways that are helpful and meaningful to you. So that's what I wanted to say about the survey itself. And Sally, before I go on, did you want to add anything particular about the survey?
Thank you, Sue. You covered that quite well. I meant to bring up the survey at the very beginning. I put something in the chat, but basically just what you said. Thanks to those who filled it out, and you were great to look at the results that you saw, and we, Eric, and you and I can look at them for follow-up as well. So thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so let's take a look at just a little bit of what we know in terms of the impact of COVID on schooling, and some of the things we know so far, so that it helps us be prepared. It helps us plan for those challenges and for meeting the needs of all students. So we know that learning and development have been disrupted for millions of students across the country. And out of that, we also know that 1 million students with special educational needs did not get the services to which they're legally entitled from a 504 or IEP plan. So all students in some way or another have been impacted and have been disrupted. And I can just say in my own experience with 40 grandchildren who attend many different schools and are in many different levels, grade levels and social emotional levels, academic levels, that I would say for, 90% of my grandchildren, they struggled. They really struggled. The time out of school, the hybrid learning, all the different things their different school systems tried was extremely challenging both for them and for their parents. And particularly those who had special needs and who either had a 504 or IEP, even more so was that difficult for them and their parents. And so they're bringing that baggage with them back into the school year this year. I will say though, for a small percentage, a few of my grandchildren in particular, and this may be true with some of the students you see, they thrived. A couple of them like this, it got them out of having to be in the mix with peers. A couple of my high school age grandchildren who just hated the sort of social drama of high school every day actually were thriving and doing better when they could just kind of learn at their own pace, be online, do their stuff, interact only with those socially that they sort of chose to in their little circle, not be in the hallways, not be at the bus stops. So you will find, that some students, the disruption was actually positive, but that's definitely both from my own limited but personal experience, as well as the data that we're seeing from across the country. That will be the minority, the ones who really found it a good thing, and more so will have found it really challenging. And so it really has exacerbated the well-documented opportunity gaps that already exist between low-income students, students that are better off, gaps in terms of access to learning and developmental opportunities, from having books in the home to, as we went to a virtual realm, to having the technology available, to having even access to food and nutrition and safe housing and healthcare, and particularly, again, during the last year and a half. So it's not that the pandemic itself caused a lot of these opportunity gaps, but it certainly put a magnifying glass to them, made them bigger, made them more visible, and really made the gap even wider. And of course, as I mentioned a moment ago, one of the most critical areas for that was the uneven access to both the devices necessary and the broadband to access the internet when that was necessary for learning. The other piece to keep in mind is that this period of time has really demonstrated sort of the limitation of standardized tests. And again, we know that standardized tests test for and reward a certain and relatively narrow set of skills that, again, tend to be more associated with students who are more affluent and have had access to the opportunities mentioned a moment ago. And that the pandemic has made those limitations even more extreme for students who easily are overwhelmed, who have a history of trauma. So this kind of testing, again, can skew the facts. It might be a student with a trauma issue or some other kind of need that may not be testing well, does not mean that we're necessarily getting the full picture of that student's learning strengths as well as challenges. So we really have to recognize that there's always been challenges with standardized testing, but again, they've been exacerbated in the past year and a half. And just to give a quick example of one particular population, I don't know how many of you are aware. I know there's a few of you identified as social workers on this webinar. I don't know how many of you are aware of the students that may be in your class or your school that also are in the foster care system. I'm not intending for this webinar to focus on these students at any length, really just this one slide about it. But I just wanted to give you an example of how one particular population during the pandemic really disengaged from school, didn't get their needs met, lost academic progress, but also had basic unmet needs in terms of their home and housing situation. And this is just one population in one state that this data comes from, but you may have immigrant students or migrant worker students, migrant worker children students. You may have students, non-English speaking as a first language students. You may have other populations, and this picture, this snapshot of the impact on this one population of students in foster care just gives us a reminder that some groups of students definitely are facing these challenges even in more ways than others. Now let's think about teachers as well and school staff, because the consequences for education in terms of the adults in the school environment is just as important, if not more so to some extent, than understanding that of the students. If we're going to have success in the school setting, and I liked the way Eric said at the beginning, you know, everyone's probably at their best mental health place right now at the beginning of a school year, but at the beginning of a school year that comes at the end of nearly 2 years of this, all the ups and downs of the pandemic, and I shouldn't use the word end because it's certainly we're not in the end at all. We're having new waves and new phases and new variants and new this and new that all the time. But what we know about teachers is that, first of all, 1/3 of all teachers in the United States are in the highest risk category, not just for getting COVID, but for being severely ill or dying. So that is a stress factor. You know, like I said, I was a teacher. I feel a kinship with teachers. If I was still a classroom teacher, just that data alone would add a layer of stress to me, even if I didn't think I was one of those at the highest risk. It would just really feel very stressful. And then, you know, because you are concerned about meeting the needs of your students and probably their families and your community, but at the same time you may have your own children, you certainly have your own circle of family, and you have your own life and health. This makes you at a significantly more increased risk for STS, secondary traumatic stress, than you may have been already in other years. Teachers are already in that caregiving category that's at a high risk of STS. Now you're even at a higher risk. And 1/3, this is a survey done by educators, 1/3 of K through 12 teachers have said that this experience of the pandemic in the past 1.5 or 2 years is causing them to seriously consider even getting out of teaching altogether and changing their profession. That's how stressful it has felt and objectively is, and also subjectively feels for teachers. And of course, because of the demands of doing both hybrid learning or all the other kinds of things that you've had to do in the past 1.5 years, you find you're working harder, at least teachers around the country do, and I imagine that's true for you, and yet getting less of what brought you into it in the first place, less of the joy, and at the same time having your own health and safety concerns. So this is what we know. The last couple of slides, what we know about the students, and then here's what we know about teachers. I'm going to pause for a second here. I'll take a little sip of my beverage. And while I do, if anyone would like to reflect in the chat box, does this resonate at all with your own experience? Is there anything that feels wrong from what I've said? Anything you want to underline or you know, add to? Please feel free to put some comments in here. And while you're thinking of any comments you might add, I would share this one additional piece that kind of goes along with what I was just talking about, that in the past 1.5 years, it hasn't only been COVID that has caused a lot of what I just talked about. It's also been other areas of disparity, and especially racial injustice has been highlighted. And there have been political upheavals that have left communities really polarized as well. So those things in addition to COVID have added to the facts that I named. All right, I'm seeing a lot coming in the chat box, and the first one said you feel supported, so I could read. That's terrific. All right, so some people noting that some of this data is not surprising, but or shouldn't be, but still tends to be interesting. Appreciation for the foster care data. Yeah, so the resurgence has dealt a blow to the hopes we had for this fall, kind of the idea that maybe we were going to have a quote back to normal, and now we're really having to reassess and say maybe we have to forget about old normal altogether. Like, we're not getting back to something, we're creating something new, and we're going to use elements from what we had before that were useful and valuable, but we're not getting back to some other normal, but we're really creating something new. So we have people grateful to be getting support, and the idea that talking about it is validated, and a couple of comments about feeling validated here. Some people feeling less vulnerable to being sick as a result of the vaccination, others worried about the new variants and the impact that will have. So thank you for putting in your comments. It seems like a lot of it really is validating. Someone mentioned, is it PTSD among both populations? And well, certainly there's levels of trauma. There's levels of trauma for the children, for the families, and for the school staff. And whether they all fall under the actual diagnostic category of PTSD or not is something we won't necessarily try to tease out today, but definitely levels of trauma. And you'll see me talk about that, hear me talk about that as we go forward. So the next piece I wanted to just think about is, you know, what is it that children and adults, all adults, the parenting and caregiving adults of the children, and you as the adults of the school community, what do we all really need right now? What does it boil down to that both the research shows and that we know from the current data around COVID and related challenges in the past 2 years, but also longer standing knowledge that we have of when there's crises, when there's school community related crises like school shootings, hurricanes that wipe out a whole, you know, school district buildings and everything. We have past events as well that we can learn from, as well as just a longer understanding of the impact of these kinds of crises and trauma. And so we know that what everyone needs right now is what has been boiled down to and called the 3 pillars of trauma-informed care and trauma-responsive care are still equally valid in the schools as well. And that is safety, both physical and psychological. That is the capacity to acknowledge and manage and regulate one's own emotions. And I'm going to refer to that. Each of these I'm going to unpack a little bit as we go forward. I'm going to unpack that emotional one around the whole concept of well-being. And then connections. Relationships and connections, lasting connections and meaningful connections. And I said and in there because not every relationship is going to fulfill both. Not every relationship will be lasting and not every relationship will be meaningful, but children and adults need both. So by lasting, we mean relationships that go beyond a season or a semester or a period of one's life, relationships that last a lifetime. So that's generally family. That's generally parents, siblings, extended family. It can be other non-relative kin, so people we think of as family, maybe a neighbor, maybe someone we call auntie who's not really related. But these are the types of relationships that literally last a lifetime, and they are very significant and important. And so therefore, everything I mentioned in the slides ahead about engaging with family is really important. Even if you think a child has a family that's not really interested, that seems apathetic, that doesn't seem to care about being engaged, still it's important to engage them. Even if you have a child that you think is coming from a family that somebody has labeled dysfunctional, still important to engage them. Because regardless, that family is going to be the through line, the lasting connection for this child. But at the same time, they need the other connections that we can provide through the school community and broader community. Meaningful connections that may not be as lasting, that may be for a season, for a period, but that can be very meaningful. And so regardless of whatever else you focus on this year in particular, the focus on connection and relationship is going to be paramount. And so you'll hear, if you don't hear much else or even anything else that I say during this session, that is the single most important thing I hope you'll take away. So safety, emotional well-being in a variety of ways, and connections both lasting and meaningful. And before I leave this slide, I'd like to point out that these three things, even though in the trauma world, they're referred to often as the three pillars of trauma-informed care, and that's why I've depicted them here as pillars. By the way, when you see any slides that look like pages you could color, this is a page you could color. It comes from a coloring book workbook about trauma and caring for children that have experienced trauma that my daughter and I created. She's the artist, I'm the writer. Half of the book is a written workbook that goes through a lot of information about what is trauma and what can adults do to support and help children who've experienced trauma. And the other half of the book, every other page is content like that, and every other page is a coloring image. And this is one example of those, and there may be a couple others in this PowerPoint before we get to the end. So if that's something you want to know more about, you can certainly contact me about that. But anyway, they're depicted here as pillars because that's what the trauma experts call it. But I like to think of it more like a three-legged stool. If you've ever had experience using or owning, or if you even at least know what I mean when I say a three-legged stool, I first noticed them when I grew up watching people in a barn milking cows, because I had family members in Vermont that were farmers. But then we had one in our house too, little three-legged stool, and my mom was shorter than my dad, and she would use it to step on to climb up to a higher shelf in the kitchen if she needed to get something down. Now, the thing about a three-legged stool is they're pretty sturdy and they're pretty good to use for purposes like that, as long as you have all three legs. You would never take the idea of a three-legged stool but have one of the legs completely broken or missing and say, here, it's fine, as long as these other two legs are in good shape, we can use it. You certainly wouldn't use it with just one of the legs. And so these are not sequential things that, well, first, as long as we make sure everyone's safe, then we'll worry about other stuff. Or, you know, first, as long as we engage in some relationships, we don't have to worry about safety. No one would say it in those words, but that's oftentimes how systems across the board, systems that work with children, start with, including education, pediatrics, mental health, child welfare, and foster care, even as you get into the teen juvenile justice system, many of these systems that work with children and families, housing systems, income maintenance, food security, often kind of have this sequential model that, well, we'll provide this first and then we'll worry about something else. And what this idea of the three-legged stool reminds us always is that children in particular, but their families as well, need all three of those pillars or all three of those legs of the stool at the same time, not sequentially, not let's do one and then do the other. So we need to keep that in mind. So when children are returning to school after this long period of maybe some have been in school, maybe some haven't, maybe some have been on virtual, maybe some haven't, maybe some haven't got COVID, maybe others didn't, maybe some had someone in their family that had COVID, maybe others didn't even know anyone who did, maybe some lost their employment, their parents lost their employment or even housing, others didn't. You know, you have this mixture, but the students that you have that did have the significant consequences of the past year and a half. So if they either were personally very sick or had a parent or close relative that was either very sick or died, if they have a parent or family member who provides for their well-being, who lost a job, if they had to move, if they lost their housing, if they were in constant fear of losing those things, and that was a stress on the adults that got passed down to the children, or if there were other factors, abuse, neglect, disability, other factors at play, then when they return to school, they're bringing to you, you know, kind of as my header says here, not just their backpack and their notebook, but they're bringing stuff in it that we need to sort of unpack and recognize. Some of their fears are things like I am really different. No one understands my life. I'm being sexually abused at home. No one knows that. Or my parents lost their job and we had to apply for food stamps and we never used food stamps before. No one knows that. Or my grandmother is in the hospital right now and she might die from COVID, and no one knows what that feels like. Whatever it might be, they're bringing this sense of, in the substance abuse world, what is sometimes called terminal uniqueness. I'm just so unique. No one will get me. No one will understand me. And then sometimes some of the students also therefore feel, and that makes being different in the circumstances not different good. I don't feel good about my differences. I feel I'm somehow second rate. Maybe I'm growing up in a family, a foster home, and I'm not living with the people I was born to. Maybe, like I said, my parents, somebody lost a job and that makes us second rate. Maybe I'm, of a background or a race different than most of the other kids in my class. Whatever it is, it might be that they feel I am just doomed to fail. And that sort of doomed to fail mentality can lead to a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy type of experience in the school setting. Also, some students may believe they're behind. They may have heard news reports that are all over the place talking about students being behind. They may have been lectured by their parents about being behind. They may have heard this message somehow and they may think, what's it worth? I'm so far behind. I'm never going to catch up. Why should I even bother trying? And then students who do have a trauma history, this is not as cognitively thought out, that trauma triggers are lurking everywhere and pop up when least expected, but they are, their brains and therefore their bodies and their emotions can be on hyper alert status. Their brains can be finely tuned in that trauma triggers are everywhere and may pop out where least expected. It could be a sensory experience, a smell, a sight, something you put up in the classroom thinking it would be welcoming and may be very well welcoming to, nearly all of your students, but might actually be triggering to a particular student. And you have no way of knowing that ahead of time, but just being aware that that's a possibility. So these are some of what they carry with them. And so what is the impact of carrying those fantasies, fears, and traumas? As I mentioned, we can see some of that sort of self-fulfilling prophecy start to happen. We absolutely know that there will be a lot of grief and loss experience. There'll be more increased levels of separation anxiety between children and their parents or caregivers, children and their siblings, other ways that a child and a teacher they had last year, there just will be higher degrees of these anxieties and actual trauma triggers. And all of that conspires to make concentration difficult. One example I sometimes use is imagine, remember, hopefully you can remember a time and not just have to imagine, but if you can remember a time ever when you had a really bad toothache. If you had a tooth that was really, really aching or sore or really loose, about to come out and kind of hurting because it wasn't quite popping out yet. But if you have a toothache that's so omnipresent in your being, how easy is it to concentrate on anything else? Your tongue is kind of constantly going over and working and worrying about that tooth. And even if you're not wanting it to, and even if you're not trying to, and even if you know it's better not to touch it and leave it alone until you can get dental care or whatever, if you've got that sore tooth, it kind of takes over and dominates. And that's just a small illustration of what it's like for many of our children, but also potentially for many of the adults in our school community as well. This challenge with concentration. Now, what this often means is that for many of our students, and their parents, frankly, we're likely to see trauma symptoms come out in the form of behavior. And the behavior is not always immediately recognizable as trauma-related behavior. So we might start seeing labels being tossed around. Oh, this child is ADD or ADHD, ODD, all these alphabet soup labels, or even some potential mental health diagnoses. So we have to kind of slow the train down a little bit. We have to be able to see, is there actual trauma that needs to be responded to in a trauma responsive way, and something else mental health wise going on? Or is it trauma that, as it gets addressed responsively and builds, and as resilience can be built, self kind of corrects? Or is it some other kind of academic or learning issue? And those things all get tangled together. And so we have to really slow the train down in terms of assessments, and ask the kind of probing questions that help us go steer in the right direction. Also, students are going to frequently, experience these physical body experiences, psychosomatic experiences, and they may express that more often than you're used to. They'll easily be triggered and launched into a survival mode, fight or flight, right? Or all the other elements of a survival mode. They'll certainly have social, and when I say they, of course, I don't mean 100% of all students. Many students who have the kinds of histories of trauma that have been exacerbated by recent year and a half will be the ones that will have these experiences. Social anxiety, and then likelihood of falling behind academically. And then we have this interesting last two bullets that some, because they might get labeled in terms of their behavior or other needs, might actually have special ed needs that get missed because we're not seeing some underlying special educational needs because we're focusing in the wrong place. But the reverse is also true. Some students during these kinds of times and with trauma histories get mislabeled as needing special ed or placed in special ed when that's not at all what they need. So it's tricky. It's real tricky around the sort of assessment for and placement for special education that happens during this time. So as we try to help support children and their families, I want to show you a framing model that you can think, and I have two versions of it. This one has, as you can see, little children. This one has older kids and teens, but the words are the same. So I'm going to just leave it on this one now that I've showed you both. But this is something that we use a lot when we're teaching parents. This is a parenting approach, but it definitely can be adapted for classroom use. But it's also, so two reasons I'm sharing this with you. One is so that you will see that this is a way, gives you an opportunity to kind of talk to parents and caregiving adults in the life of a children and help some language and some ideas about how to talk to them about their role. And it also helps you think about how your role can support that role in the child's life and in the parent's life. So as you see, that set of hands needs to provide sort of two different and yet concurrent types of support for children. And one is the hand that's sort of the base from which the child or the teen can go off, can be curious, can learn, can explore, can even take risks, can try new things. And that the adults in their life are the base that let them do that, but also the cheerleaders that cheer them on and that pay attention and that watch them and take delight and occasionally, if they need some help, be there to give that little boost or that support that they need without dominating or overshadowing their capacity to do their own exploration. At the same time, the parent and caregiving adult in the classroom or the community needs to be that safety, that haven that the child can return back to for comfort, for protection, for safety. That they feel welcome, that they feel I can turn to you. You're not going to belittle me. You're not going to bully me. You're not going to ignore me if I come back to you and need help or need welcoming or need safety. So I'm going to, again, take a moment here to pause and just see, are there any comments or questions on some of this material I've shared so far before I go on? Again, you can use the chat for that.
And Sue, I just want to add, as we're waiting for folks to comment and add questions, that in Maine, we have about 20% of our youth report 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. And that survey was done before the pandemic. So already, you know, it's easy for us, I think, in some of our communities to think, oh, we don't have a lot of kids with traumatic lives. But we have about 20% who report 4 or more ACEs. And now with the pandemic, another form of trauma. So I just wanted to add that data for context.
Absolutely, and that's really helpful, Sally, because it's so important to recognize that if there's 1, 2, or 3 adverse childhood experiences, most of the data around ACEs shows that with natural coping mechanisms and natural support systems, most people can weather those storms of adversity, and if there's 1, 2, or 3. But when you get to the 4 or more, that's a critical juncture where from 4 or more onward, it's not enough to have one's natural coping mechanisms, natural support system. That often is not enough to mitigate. And that additional intentional trauma-informed, trauma-responsive, resiliency-focused support is needed. So that's a really good point to highlight, and to remember that the students that you see that are having these struggles and their families may need more than just sort of a good, naturally supportive, sort of healthy, socially, again, supportive school environment, which is a good thing in and of itself. And having raised my kids most of the years in Philadelphia after we left New England, and seeing how a big, large urban school system has such variances between just a generally good school social environment and one that's not, that's a great thing in and of itself, but it's not enough for kids with 4 or more ACEs. So that's a really important observation. And parents feeling guilty is certainly another aspect, which actually, Eric, quite nicely leads us into our next piece, is that the other thing we want to do besides being that support this was very child-centric, what can we do for the child? The other piece is that we need to focus on supporting families, family resilience. So you probably are attending or hearing or reading about things related to supporting resilience in children and in students in the classroom in particular. All good, all important. I'm even going to mention a few of those tips as we get a little further in. But at the same time, we need to do what we can in our engagement with families, in anything, materials that go home, in any home and school activities that are offered, in any liaisons that we offer between the home and school. We need to really focus on, are we supporting family resilience? And of course, the first thing is to understand what does that actually mean? Because individual resilience of individual family members contributes to family resilience, but it's not the same thing. Family resilience really is about how the family functions together as a group. And if a family, if you observe and you identify that a family is struggling in 1 or more of these ways, 4 on this slide, 4 on the next slide, it's not meant as, oh, well, then this family's in deep trouble. I need to make referrals. I need to, I need to report them to some other system. It's not about that. This is about, if you recognize that they're having some challenges in 1 or more of these areas, this gives you an opportunity to understand how you can best focus the supports you are able to provide. You'll see another slide about this later in the session, but we have to focus on what resources do we have internally in ourselves and within our school community that we can provide, and not rely only on external community providers, because they might not exist in our particular community. The one that does exist might not be the right one for some reason or another. And not every family needs to be, quote, referred out. If we can just be aware of these things, we can create the kind of environment that can serve them. So before I say more about family resilience, just the comment, it's difficult to navigate definitions of trauma, that what a child sees as trauma may be completely different than our own interpretation. You're absolutely right about that. It's experience. The definition of trauma definitely has to do with how one's brain and body experiences something. And actually that's a whole separate workshop that I teach, where we get deeply into those definitions and try to understand them better. If it's something you want later on, I'm happy to do it. But you're absolutely right. It's understanding that if a child experiences something as trauma, then it's traumatic, whether it would be labeled trauma from an adult perspective or not. So to Eric's point, to Peggy's sort of support for that point mentioned in the chat, I just want to encourage you to focus on family resilience. So some things to be aware of is maintaining membership. Does the family have a sense we are all still a family, even if one of our family members is in the hospital or had to travel far away to get a job, or is in some other kind of placement, or separated from us in some way? Are we able to still have this sense of being family? Is the family still able to nurture their young and care for their most vulnerable? And again, if they're struggling in those areas, how can we best support them? And are they able to maintain economic support, or do they need assistance with that? And that is one area, of course, where we wouldn't be able to do that as the school, but might be able to make referrals that could help. 4 other things to look for in terms of supporting family resilience are more of the characteristics of the family themselves, their beliefs, their way of going about life. Do they have some shared beliefs? Do they have a sense of hope and optimism? We're going to get through this. Whatever hard time we're in, we're going to get through it together. Are they able to communicate about a wide range of feelings? And so, you know, assisting your students in communicating about feelings, but also sending home materials or in your engagement with parents that it's okay to communicate about a wide range of feelings. Are they able to balance consistency and flexibility? So what do I mean by that? I mean that they, the times that are crisis times, like the pandemic has been, might mean that some things aren't as consistent as they used to be. They're having to patch together stuff. So they have to be flexible. Are they able to do that flexibility without constantly being stressed about it? And are they able to build in some consistency along the way, even if other aspects of their life are kind of in turmoil and chaos? And then finally, capacity for problem solving. So if both parents are essential workers and have to work, but the children aren't yet in school, or, you know, if one child is on a virtual program, but another child is in school, or one child is in a school that masks are optional and another one has to wear masks, whatever the different things are, are they able to problem solve those circumstances, or talk it out and work through it with perhaps your support, or do they have someone in their life that gives them that support? And then this is a chart, and you'll I've shared the PowerPoint with Sally, and she's welcome to share it with all of you. There'll be a PDF version that you can have, and you'll have this kind of a chart here. This is something that I provide more for just a broader way of looking at what I just talked about family resilience, some of the things to kind of look for and or support through your efforts, your communication, your engagement with the family and the caregiver of the children. So we are going to just look at some broad tips, but before we do, this is a good time for the second poll. And so as before, I will read it to you. And again, it's a multiple choice. So if you think there's more than one answer, please choose as many as you like. Educators can support families as they transition students back to in-school learning by giving them lots of materials, worksheets, and supplies, focusing on social emotional learning, reinforcing that relationship and well-being is more important than academic accomplishment at a time like this, create very strict expectations related to vaccinations and mask wearing, allow for flexibility related to vaccinations and mask wearing, do as much as possible to make everything the way it used to be, use the learning from COVID to address inequities related to race, socioeconomic status, and learning differences. So we've had about a third of you reply, so I'm going to leave it up about another 10 or 15 seconds to give more of you the opportunity to weigh in. All right, I see we've gotten 75% of you in, so I'm just going to leave it a few more seconds, and then I'll close it out. Great. Close it now and share the results. So focus on relationships got the most votes from all of you, and I love that because that's what I really wanted to emphasize today. So you're already there. That's awesome. And using the learning, so at a policy level, at a system-wide level, as well as the individual teacher classroom level, can we use the learning from COVID to address other inequities that have long been plaguing our systems, but maybe haven't gotten as much attention? There's a few that want to return things as much as possible to the way they used to be. Normalcy, the idea of it is valuable, and at the same time we have to be careful not to just continue the way things were with inequities and things like that. So we don't want to make everything the way it used to be, but things that were valuable we don't want to throw out, you know, while we're also carving out this new normal. Materials and worksheets and other resources for families can be valuable as long as we be careful not to overwhelm families. And then being clear about your policies related to mask wearing and vaccinations. Allowing for flexibility is often the way that schools need to go, but being clear, but also being open to communicate is important there. So I will take this down now, and we'll just, some of the broad tips that many different, several different organizations, you know, school board organizations, parent-teacher associations, teacher unions, associations of National Association of Social Workers, lots of different groups, pediatricians and pediatric mental health have done these different looks at what has happened and what would be best then to help support learning. So these are from all these different sort of expert resources, locating resources. So the more that you can locate learning resources that will help meet the needs of your students where they are now. You know, this idea that they have to catch up, I think you've probably also seen a lot of social media and other places where it says, let's not make the focus on catching up. Let's make the focus on finding where they are now and kind of building on that. So locating necessary learning resources, including some that are out there from even the corporate community. Be careful of commercialization, but different companies and other online platforms are starting to offer some interesting educational resources. Take a look at them. Identify other additional resources such as what your school might be providing in regard to meals or technology, laptops, tablets, or mental health services, or school home liaisons for parents, or access to places where they can get vaccines or testing or things like this. Communicate, stay in touch. Communicate with families, communicate with each other, communicate with your administration, so that everyone kind of is on the same page or is hearing what the concerns are or is hearing about strategies that have been useful or helpful. Be proactive about making those needs and expectations clear, as was mentioned in the poll, and to the extent that you're able to be flexible, be as flexible as you're able to be. And as we think about this period of adjustment, some of the quick tips to just kind of always keep at the tip of your tongue. The one I've been saying from start to finish here, relationships matter more than schoolwork. Please take that time to build your own relationship with the students, with the family members, with the parents. Help the students with their relationships to one another. Do it in a learning way. Use learning skills. I'm not saying we don't want to help students learn academically, but the underlying focus initially especially needs to be relationship. You need to know the kids and yourself and your staff and your community. You need to know how schedules, that your particular class this year, do they do well with schedules? Do they need things kind of really spelled out? Do they need more flexibility? Do they need more small group time? Do they need more large group time? You've got to know your own self and what works for you, so you don't burn out, so you don't get the full-on impact of the secondary traumatic stress on yourself. So you got to really know yourself and the others that you're working with. And again, not just returning to pre-COVID approaches. This is not the time to do those assessments that are going to sit in a student's file forever and label them and sort of start or further a path that they've got a label of a certain diagnosis, a certain special ed need, or that they're not special ed eligible because we did this assessment and they're not. Whichever way, those kind of long-term permanent assessments, this is not the time because of all the other trauma-related factors that may be involved. But you have to do some assessment. You have to do some ability to see how students are faring, where they're at. So yes, do some assessments, but just remember, we need to then be flexible enough to revisit them a few months down the road and not assume that whatever we learned right at the beginning, it should be set in granite. And please make sure we're attending to the needs of the teachers and staff. So this is more for the administrators here or for the teachers to advocate for yourself. If we don't address self-care, if we don't address secondary trauma, then all of this other stuff won't really work. And the relationship piece especially won't work if teachers and staff are not in a place personally where they're able to do that. So we have to attend to the self-care and secondary trauma needs of the staff and teachers. Now, as we're helping parents navigate their role at home, we still want to help them as there's a transition going on. Can they relax some of the rules, particularly around device time? Because there's still a lot of transition into some things being virtual, and students may need, you know, some device time more than the parents in some cases may want to offer. So, you know, help them to not feel guilty if they relax some of that time. Use resources like to help parents understand that when you give them a resource, whether it's a worksheet or a handout or a link to a website or a referral to some agency down the street, that those are good things that they're welcome to use, encouraged to use, but not required to use. Parents often feel like they're being given a drink of water out of a fire hose. And so we have to take steps to make sure they don't feel overwhelmed by us. Always follow the child's interests, and you can make almost anything into a learning opportunity, but if you start with the child's interests, then they will feel more supported, the relationship will be built with more trust, and they'll still learn. Important to move their bodies inside the classroom and at home. Children shouldn't have to sit still, really, for even all ages of children shouldn't have to completely sit still for more than 20 minutes without some form of capacity to move. And also remember the 20-20-20 rule. I don't know if you've heard of this one, but after every 20 minutes of staring at anything that's device oriented, even if it's a video in the classroom, if it's computers at their desktop, if it's home-based computer learning, after every 20 minutes, and you all should be doing this even in a webinar like this one that I'm teaching now. So we've been more than 20 minutes in. So if you haven't done this already, then I invite you right now, take your eyes away from the screen. Look at something in your space, in your area that's at least 20 feet away, and look at it for at least 20 seconds before you return your eyes to the screen. So every 20 minutes, if you're going to be on a device or on screen time, every 20 minutes, take at least 20 seconds to look away from the screen and look at something at least 20 feet away. You need that for eye health and brain health. And then try to build in ways that you can have at least a little bit of one-on-one time, and that you help parents figure out strategies if they have more than one child. It's okay if one-on-one time is we're doing a chore together. It's okay if one-on-one time is while we're in the car riding to an appointment together. One-on-one time doesn't have to be a special outing or a special occasion, but just to allow some time so that we can check in with students and children at home in that one-on-one way. It's also really important to have some predictability. Like I said, we're going to have flexibility because of things that have changed during COVID, but the more we can offer predictability without being rigid. So we need to sort of internally in your school, some of your follow-up opportunity and conversations should be, how do we manage uncertainty and unpredictability? What kind of visual aids can we have in the classroom? Charts, calendars, timelines, things that we all do to keep ourselves safe, hand washing, you know, tips for mask wearing, whatever it might be. How do we use our environment, our visuals around time and routines and expectations, and even consequences for when things don't go as they should, that it's going to be predictable, and one student isn't going to get screamed at while another student gets a pat on the back, while another student gets sent in the hallway, while another student has to stay after school, and another one gets a note home. Now, you might have to do some of those individualized things, but there should be a predictability that the student's going to know, well, if I cross this line, this is what's likely to happen. So we don't want to be rigid, but we do need to figure out how to be predictable without being rigid. So when we're not going to be rigid, when we're going to break the schedule in some way, we need to also be able to talk about it and say, well, today we're going to try something different. Or I know usually this would be the time for music, but today we're going to do this first or this instead, and that's going to start in 10 minutes. just giving some, keeping order out of chaos, especially around transitions. Transition times are often the hardest for students, all students, and when anyone is facing trauma or any kind of social anxiety or other kind of social emotional need, transitions can be the most difficult. So how can we in the classroom make transitions as peaceful and calm as possible? And how can we give tips home for families to do that? Think about ways you transition yourself from work to home. If anyone would like to put that in the chat, feel free. You know, what are some of your little rituals that you might do that kind of help you de-stress or regroup or decompress? And is there anything you can even learn from your own use of that sort of transition time that you can offer or provide to your students? And I'd like you to think about this in three, I'm going to say ABC. I'm going to give an example of a few tips that are listed under the A, B, and C category. The A is for actions and activities. So help a child or an adult identify specific types of activities that they can do, that are actions they can do. In especially these three categories: an activity that strengthens you, makes you feel strong; an activity that calms you, makes you feel peaceful or relaxed; and an activity that inspires you, that nurtures your goals or your dreams. Okay, and thank you, Nancy, for kicking off, giving us some tips about some of those. And that's an action. That's an action, taking a walk. And maybe that taking a walk might be an action that's calming, or maybe it's an action that's strengthening. Maybe it's when you dream or something. It can be all three, it can be one or the other. But helping students and family members and adults identify these kind of actions and then find a small version of it. So yes, you might like to take that walk and it might be 10 minutes or it might be an hour after work, but is there a small version? Can I stand up and walk, you know, across the room and back, or just step outside in the hall and walk back in? Is there some short way? If walking is my thing, or if it's a child who's, you know, whatever they identify, is there some way I can do that in a 30-second version, that if I'm being stressed or there's a transition time in the classroom, I can do my 30-second version of my strengthening or calming or inspiring activity? And so I would love to have more of you keep putting some of these in the chat. As we go on to B, the B is for balance, balancing mind, heart, body, spirit, and senses. So, you know, really resetting the brain and the body. One of the best ways to do that is, of course, through breathing, helping yourself and your students learn when it's okay to take some extra mindful, intentional breaths. In fact, I'm going to ask you to just do that right now. Just go ahead, and I'm going to just pause for a second and just take 3 breaths where you breathe in to a count of 4, hold it for a count of 4, and then breathe out for a count of 4. Okay, I'm just going to be silent taking my own breaths, but I'm going to ask you to take 3 of those intentional breaths right now. Find fun ways to introduce resetting the brain by breathing with your students. As you see in the picture here, bubbles is one of my favorites. I keep bubbles everywhere. I have had bubbles written into students' 504 plans and IEPs, that they need to always have access to bubbles so that when they're feeling even the least bit stressed, they can pull out a bottle of bubbles and blow some. Having bubbles in the classroom. But there's other ways you can teach intentional breathing. Bubbles is a fun way because it also is sort of contagious. It helps other people breathe intentionally too when they see the bubbles, and it kind of becomes a collective or communal shared activity. Joan has mentioned a great resource to implement mindfulness activities throughout the day, helping teachers change the world. So awesome. I am familiar with that as well, and it is a great resource, so I encourage use of it. Movement, like I said, help create opportunities for movement. Try every 20 seconds, even if it's sort of get up and stretch, even if it's make a circle around the room, even if it's who can jump 3 times before I count to 3, whatever you can do to just get a little bit of body movement on a regular basis, as well as longer opportunities for movement provided by recess, lunch breaks, gym class, things like that. Nurture creativity not only when it's a creative, quote, class like art class or music, but when it's math or when it's you know, a reading assignment or something. Nurture students who try new things, who do things creatively, learn creatively. Build in laughter and play. There's some great research that shows that you can learn, when you need to learn something new, it usually requires about 400 repetitions. Unless you learn it through play and laughter, you can learn it in as few as 20 repetitions. So it's not all about being silly. Laughter and play actually helps with learning. And then the C in my ABCs is communicate and connect. So for families, I encourage them to continue eating meals together, to continue showing affection, and to never hinge your relationship on behavior, like you won't get to see your friend next week if your behavior was bad in school. These are some tips to give adults, parents, caregivers, but how can you do this also in the school setting? You know, how do you utilize food and opportunities to have snacks or food that you can share with students? How do you use touch in any way, and have you had conversations about that, and do you know what is safe, what is helpful, what is meaningful? You know, you've seen probably in social media different examples of teachers that offer a everything from a hug to a handshake to a high five to just a almost virtual high five. Different ways. Is it okay when you're walking around the classroom to touch this child on the shoulder? That sort of thing. Have these conversations. Be aware of what will work and what is meaningful. And then the same thing about not hinging relationships on behavior. So if you're going to give consequences for in-class behavior, don't ever have it be, well, then you don't get something that's relationship-based. That's what you lose. That's really critical to not tie those two things together. We have another suggestion from Erin about a tool called Virgin Pulse through your health plan, and has lots of tips and other things you can do. So this is also a great resource one I wasn't familiar with. So thank you for sharing that. Now we're going to go a little beyond COVID and think about policy and practice that just generally supports those areas that I talked about with the three pillars or the three-legged stool. And before we do, we're actually going to do the next three polls kind of all at once, and well, one at a time, but one after the other. So this is poll 3. These are designed to help you sort of connect personally with where you were at as a student, and then how that might be for students you have in your classroom. So the first one is around safety. When I was in school, and you can only pick one this time, it's not multiple choice. I always or usually felt safe. I rarely or never felt safe, or I never really gave much thought to my safety. So we've gotten about half of you weighing in. I'll give it another handful of seconds to get more of you. Okay, we're up to 3/4, just about 10 more seconds, then we'll close it out. Okay, so we'll take a look at this one. And look at that, there's very few, there are some of you, and to you, I really extend my hope that we're not creating more unsafe experiences even in this webinar. I'm grateful to see that there's many of you that either always or usually felt safe or never even had to think about it. Imagine that, just being so genuinely safe that you didn't even have to think about it. That's something you didn't even have to give a thought to. So let's take that one off, and if we could have poll 4. No, let's see, the next one. There we go, poll 4. How is school related to family and emotional stability? This one is multiple choice. You might see more than one answer you think is meaningful to you. And again, I will read them. They're not really that related. It's hard to concentrate or do well in school if you don't have a safe, stable family situation. Lack of family stability often results in lack of, that should say, school success. Sorry, I might have left that off. Caring teachers, coaches, or school-based mentors can make up for instability at home. Multiple school or family moves result in lower academic achievement or opportunities. And again, I see we've gotten just about half of you in, so I'm going to just leave the poll up for a few more seconds. Okay, we have gone over 75, so I think I'll end this one. And many of you noted and probably already knew this before I mentioned it, but definitely I had mentioned it earlier as well, that it's hard to concentrate in school if things at home are challenging, right? And then the lack of family stability can result in a lack of school success. Multiple moves do that. That should be even a higher result on that bottom one, because multiple moves in the school or in the family do result very often in lower academic achievement or opportunities. And then caring teachers, coaches, or school-based mentors can make up for instability at home. Is kind of a trick answer there. Caring teachers, coaches, and school-based mentors add a wealth of benefit to students. They don't make up for instability at home in the sense of meeting the same needs. So it's still critical, as much as you can be the best possible caring teacher, coach, school-based mentor, that you still work on engagement with families and supporting family resilience. That's why I spent so much time on that earlier in the session, because you can't just replace it by what you do at school. It has to be both and, hand in hand. Okay, and so then if we could do one more, poll number 5. All right, and this is another one that's about your own experience when I was in school, and it's multiple choice. You can pick as many as relate to you. Sometimes school lunches were my only meals. I hated school lunch, so I brought my own. The school lunch was my primary healthcare provider. I never needed the school nurse. We had our own family doctor. I knew there was at least one adult who I could talk to if things were on my mind. I felt cared for and understood by teachers and other adults. I felt uncared for or misunderstood by teachers and other adults. And you might have to scroll to see all the answers on this one. I often fell asleep in class because things were bad at home. I worried about my siblings or parents frequently, which distracted me from school success. My family supported my schoolwork and took delight in my accomplishments. And we've just gotten about half of you on that. I know there's a lot of choices there, so I will give it a few more seconds so more of you can get your answers in. Okay, great. We've gotten over 75% of you, over 80% now. So I think I'll just leave it up about 5 more seconds and then shut it down. Okay, I'll end it. Share results. So just look at some things like how few of us say that school's meals were our only meal, or the school nurse was our primary healthcare provider. And that may differ considerably from the experience of a lot of the students we see. How few of us fell asleep in class because of problems at home, how different that may be from students we see. How many of us knew we had adults we could talk to and felt cared about and understood, and probably how important that was to your overall development. But look at the numbers are almost identical. In fact, they are. Those of you who felt you had an adult you could talk to, who felt cared about and understood by teachers and other adults at school, and that you had a family that supported your schoolwork and took delight in your accomplishments. You see, those things have to go hand in hand together. One doesn't replace the other. So that's what we need to strive to build in our work. So we'll stop sharing that. So these last few minutes, I'm going to just highlight some ways we can support safety, those 3 pillars: safety, emotional well-being, and connectedness and relationships. So we have to think about supporting both physical and psychological safety. We have to have go-to people for the students as well as for the parents, all students, especially those who might be struggling or have special needs. Whenever we can provide choices, that really helps with that sense of safety, having a choice, having a voice. Taking another good look at our anti-bullying and community building kind of practices and making sure they're inclusive and that they're updated for the current circumstance that we're in. ensure that all special populations of students, none of them receive harsher disciplinary actions than other students, and being proactive about addressing the kinds of needs and expectations related to specific COVID issues like vaccinating and masking. This is an example of a consideration for mask supporting or having times when masking is not important. I'm not going to go over this right now. Obviously, our time is getting shorter here, but I wanted to include it. You have it as in your handout. When you get the PowerPoint, you'll have this that you can use as a way of thinking about the masking and the prioritizing of masking. So supporting safety is one thing, supporting stability is another. Moves, whether it's, we often think about that in terms of kids in foster care, they move a lot, but lots of children with special educational needs or trauma histories or behavioral challenges move between classrooms or get changed from one classroom to another or move too many teachers in similar ways. Or a child whose home situation, they're not in foster care, but their home situation is unstable. Maybe they're homeless for a while, maybe they have to live with a relative for a while. Do we make it possible for them to stay in their same classroom, their same teacher? Are we giving meaningful and concrete supports to those families so that that stability can be encouraged? And are we ensuring that we have a collaborative type of engagement with community partners like Sally and her organization, as well as other community partners who might be able to help us in this regard? And as we think about supporting emotional and mental health well-being, we have to think about it initially in terms of both trauma and resilience. That's why I introduced that so early on. So we want to make sure, and I loved the comment actually that was made about, we have to be careful about the definitions of trauma. Yes, we need training and coaching and support to ensure that we're not only trauma informed and we have this nuanced capacity for ongoing, so both nuanced and ongoing, that's what I'm encouraging you to have, nuanced and ongoing conversations about trauma and trauma responsiveness so that you can really in a natural way become not just trauma informed, but trauma responsive and focused on resilience. And then help teach children. It says youth here. I often refer to youth, but I even mean tiny little children as young as your preschoolers all the way up to your adolescents, who usually would be the ones called youth. Teaching them their own self-regulation skills. I talked about the bubble blowing, but there's so many other examples that you can teach. And provide those multisensory tools, including safe spaces for that emotional expression and management and regulation, either in the classroom or in the school building in some way. And again, there's lots of online resources that help to have ideas about how you can have, a self-care corner, a cozy corner, a calm down corner, a box of tools and supplies, possibly a different room in the building that you go to, possibly a specific, resource person in the building whose office is full of multisensory tools and supplies. Different ways that you can manage that, but pay attention to that and figure that out. Of course, part of well-being does mean supporting academic achievement. So as I said earlier, let's not put children in special ed only because we think they have behaviors that may well be trauma-based. Let's not use that as our only basis for special ed, but figure out other ways we can provide tools and supports that they might need. On the other hand, students who may need special ed, let's get them the most comprehensive and trauma-informed assessments and services so that they can really get the right dose at the right time of the right service. I often have said, and I know when you don't have a lot of resources, sometimes it's easy to just give resources that, at least it's something is better than nothing. But imagine if you had a heart attack or your spouse had a heart attack and someone said, well, then they need a doctor, and the doctor that's closest is a podiatrist, or the doctor that our insurance covers is a podiatrist. Or we have 3 doctors in the area. We have a podiatrist and a gynecologist and a dermatologist. Which one should I go to when I have a heart attack? And that seems ridiculous when we say it that way in regard to a physical health need. But when we think of mental health needs, we kind of say, oh, a therapist is a therapist, or a mental health counselor is a mental health counselor. they're as unique and different as that podiatrist and dermatologist and gynecologist and cardiac specialist. And if the issue is trauma, we need someone with that kind of training. And then we want to work on any kind of credit recovery students might need as a result of any school they missed in the past year and a half. So all of this means we have to tune in. And I love using the image of an old-fashioned radio that actually has a dial that you had to turn the knob to get your station. Because the reason I use that is when you weren't on your station yet, you were getting static. But the station was never broadcasting static. The station was always broadcasting their music, news, sports, whatever they were broadcasting. Your effort at tuning in wasn't to influence or change what they were broadcasting. It was merely to receive it. And that's what tuning in is about. We're not trying to influence or change our students' lives and home lives in the beginning when we're tuning in. Eventually, over time, hopefully we do influence. But in the beginning, tuning in is not about influencing, it's about receiving. Understanding how the child is feeling, questions they may be having, what is their understanding of what's happening around them, and who might they be concerned about. And then use the resources you do have. It's hard to hand off to outside resources if all you have is that podiatrist, right? So as indicated throughout this presentation, there is much you can do. And so keep teaching and providing those coping tools and skills while taking care of yourself. Focus on relationship. And before making outside referrals, be sure that they are the appropriate ones, again, to use that analogy I just used of the podiatrist and so forth. And if there are services you find a lot of students in your community need that just simply aren't there, enlist others also in helping advocate. Don't just burn yourself out. Now, there's a couple slides at the end here that are mostly about older youth and getting ready to transition out of school. Some of you may be teachers that have that. So I just wanted you to know it's here. I'm not going to spend time on it right now in our last waning minutes. But there's also the concept of advocacy, making sure students and adults have what they need to be their best possible advocates and be equipped. And then finally, that it's not about always the individual ways we support individual children and families, but also those broader school-based activities that help ensure that we're providing support groups and other language use and opportunity. So with that, we have 3 or 4 minutes left. I am going to take the PowerPoint off. I'm going to put my own camera back on so you can see that I'm really still here. And I would be happy to entertain any questions. I don't know if I missed any in the chat. I don't think so. But I will look at the chat and then also kind of turn it back to Sally and her team to wrap us up.
That's great. Thanks, Sue. The most important thing is to get your comments and questions in, but I just wanted to also quickly show, we're trying to keep our CTBH.org page for schools, resources for schools up to date. And I can put some of Sue's resources and things that you've mentioned here. But one of the things, I think I told you about this, Sue, that Maine has, which is absolutely amazing and free, is this Cell for Me, Social Emotional Learning with Intention. I won't go on about what it is, but many, many resources that you can use this year and in coming years, which will help you focus on social emotional learning, their classroom activities and curriculum. It goes with the DOE recommendations, etc. I won't read all that, but I think that's really probably your most valuable local resource to do a lot of what Sue's been talking about.
Yeah, that's great. And I see Eric's question in the chat. Other people are welcome to chime in with responses, but if you were a teacher on Monday, first day of school, what is one goal you'd have for that particular day? And my one goal really would be that every student felt seen, every student felt heard, every student felt welcome, and that I made some kind of initial connection with every parent of every student. And that relationship, first step, building those relationships, making sure everyone feels seen and heard and safe and welcome, would it be absolutely my one goal for that first day. So I know our time is basically up. If there are other questions, you're also welcome to get them to me later. I will be staying in touch with Sally and her team and Eric about the follow-up opportunities later in the fall as well. So if you have things you'd like to share that way, please feel free.
So Sue, did you say just now, is it okay if I share your email with folks, or?
Yes, absolutely.
I didn't already? Okay.
Yeah, and I'll send to you, Sally, I didn't send the right one yet, but I'll send the PDF version of the PowerPoint so that you can share it as a handout for everyone that participated.
And of course, everybody on the webinar is welcome to communicate with Gina, Stephanie, and myself. I saw that there's some new staff that wanted to reach out, which is awesome. And you've all been added to our newsletter and invitation list now because you are registered for this. You can unsubscribe if you don't want to keep getting things from us, but hopefully you'll find that useful. Again, our website is ctbh.org, choosetobehealthy.org, and then there's a whole page just for schools. And the Cell for Me is pretty amazing. We've had Kelly Bailey and Bear Shea, who developed it, present to our schools before, but you might not be familiar with it. And Sue, I'm more in love with you than I was before. Every time I talk to Sue, you know, I didn't know that she lived in an RV, for instance, until I Zoomed with her after the presentation I saw. And that was just fascinating. Your background is fascinating. Your education, your professional experience, I just loved today. I think other people did too. I hope they did. And I learned some new things. I will just say to everybody, this was tailored to you. This was different than the presentation I saw. Sue, thank you for doing that. That was so nice of you. So thank you, everybody. If anybody has any final thoughts, I know it's after 9:30. You're getting lots of thank yous, so that's good. Thank you to everybody that came. There were folks from the Marshwood School System, the Wells School System, the Noble School System, and just about everybody, I think, from the Kittery School System. Thank you, Eric, and your administration for making this a priority. I'm sorry it wasn't a good day for every school, but thank you so much to Kittery for making this a priority, and thank you, Sue, as always. You are my guru now. Check out her website sometime if you get a chance. She's an interesting lady, that's for sure, besides being smart. Eric, any final thoughts from you?
Just thank you, Sally, for facilitating this opportunity and navigating through it. I know that the virtual platform can be stressful, especially with over 100 people. But this was fantastic. So thank you, and Sue, thank you as well, and Gina and the staff at Choose to Be Healthy. Thanks for everything you do for us.
Thanks. So we will end here. Sue and Eric will be in touch to chat about next steps for our schools.
Sounds good.
Thank you. Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Get vaccinated. Stay healthy. Bye.
Bye.